All right. As we get close to the end of the year here, we're going to start looking here at, whoa, moving around and not doing what I need to do. We're start looking here at Ford and Carter, right? So we got Gerald Ford after Richard Nixon, and eventually the election of Jimmy Carter. So, like we mentioned in class the other day, the economy was dipping, right? We had stagnation, or what they were referring to at the time as stagflation, right? And the problem was you had rising inflation and a steady unemployment rate. And so a lot of this was because of government spending. And as it says right there, this lack of competitive advantage. The United States, right, where we had blown up after the war, the rest of the world began to catch up, right? So, a good example of this would be like the auto industry in Japan, right? The United States had fostered that economy, right, and brought it along. And now the auto industry in Japan was booming and it was competing against the American market and bringing something different to the thing, namely more gas efficient cars, which during the energy crisis of the 70s became more um, attractive. So Gerald Ford will be, as it says right here, the first unelected president, right? So remember, Spiro Agnew uh, got basically exposed for like corruption and stuff like that. So he resigned from the presidency or the vice presidency. The way that it works is they don't have like another election for the vice president. The president just, basically appoints a new vice president. And so he picked uh, Congressman, I think, from Michigan, Gerald Ford. Um, Ford will be very steady, former college football player, right? He'll get a bad rap as being not like the brightest president, but in reality, he was a good president for the time that he was in the office. Um, but as the point back to first elected, right? He doesn't get elected anywhere in the process, right? He's appointed by Nixon to be the vice president. Nixon resigns, and then he becomes the president. So there was never a vote cast for him. He will pardon Nixon, which will upset some people, but his whole rationale is that it will help to heal the country, right? That's the idea. Um, the nation needed to move on from Watergate, needed to move on from Nixon, and he didn't. If they took him to trial and did all that stuff, it would drag out for years and it would just kind of make the wound fester. So this way they pardon him and they move on. There's always the conspiracy theory that it was all like a deal and all that sort of stuff, which is not true, but the idea was yet again to move on from the problem so that way the country could move on. Uh, in Helsinki, Finland, he will sign the Helsinki Accords, sometimes referred to as this Helsinki Agreement because it's not like a treaty. But what this was another step in détente. Remember the idea there being the lessening of friction between the Soviet Union and the United States, right? And what this basically did was the two blocks in Europe. So you had the Western bloc, right, of kind of the NATO countries, and the Eastern bloc, which were the Soviet countries. All of the countries signed this agreement, and it basically said that they would kind of roll back some things. Namely, the United States and the Soviet Union said that like it should be okay if countries like want to change their governments, right, peacefully without anybody's interference. Um, in doing this, the United States um, also reaffirmed that the sort of forced occupation of the Baltic states. Namely, they didn't think that it was fair that they were forced to be Soviet, right, communist or whatever, and so they reaffirmed that. They're like, hey, we don't stand up for this, but it was a big step in eventually loosening the Cold War and making it a little bit better. I think it was most people see it as a big step, even though most people, in the United States and the government and whatever didn't see it as anything major. Um, it was a step towards the eventual, sort of thawing of hostilities. And also, like I said before, with Vietnam, when Watergate hits, we kind of abandon South Vietnam, and Gerald Ford is there, kind of left holding the bag as North Vietnam rolls in. Feminist victories and defeats here in the early 70s. In 1970, you're going to have it's actually called the Women's Strike for Equality. It was to celebrate the 50-year anniversary of I think it's the 19th Amendment, 20th Amendment, don't remember which one, but namely the right to vote. And feminists from that time period were calling for um, stuff like the Equal Rights Amendment, abortion, and equality in basically in society. And I know that sounds like silly, especially in today's idea of what we think of as equality, but 1970, it was a big thing. Like, Harvard didn't allow women until 1977, right? Sandra Day O'Connor, the famous Supreme Court justice, had a law degree from Stanford, and she, upon graduation, could not get a lawyer job, right? She could only become a secretary when she applied for jobs. So there was a very obvious double standard in the world in the early 70s. Even today, right, the notion of like women getting paid less than men. And so with this, right, you had the Equal Rights Amendment, which was attempted to be passed, and um, you can look at the history of it. And it's one of those things where like a lot of the states approve it and some states don't, and it gets really close, and then Congress extends some timeline, and then eventually it all falls apart. Uh, Title IX is basically the notion of like women's stuff has to be equal to men's stuff, and this is most usually seen when it comes to public funding of schools, I should say. And this comes into play today most notably in sports, right? If your college spends a lot of money on, say, the football program, then in turn they're going to spend a lot of money on women's sports programs in other ways. So your best example, I would say, locally is Texas A&M, right? They spend a lot of money on the football program. They then turn around and spend a lot of money on the women's soccer program and the women's basketball program and all that sort of stuff. And so the amount of money has to be equal. And this is also, as a side note, why a lot of those schools will probably never have like a men's soccer program or a lacrosse program, because of all of a sudden, if they add those programs, they then have to turn around and spend that money on women's programs. And so it kind of keeps keeps them from adding other stuff, but it does make sure that it's equal and stuff like that. Now, lastly, up here we have the Roe v. Wade decision. Not going to jump too far into this. I'm sure you guys have looked at it in theology class. For the feminists, not yet again from the you know Christian Catholic school viewpoint, but for the feminists, this was a big win, right? The idea of women getting control of their bodies. Yet again, not getting into the aspect of um, life and inception and all that sort of stuff, which obviously at the school we teach, uh, abortion is wrong and evil. But yet again, in this notion of the 70s, it was a big win for women, right, who felt like this gave them control over their body. Now, the Bicentennial Campaign, so 1976, right, 200th anniversary of the United States inception there. You might not remember these, but as a kid growing up, I always loved these. These were the drummer boy quarters that they issued in 1976. So it was always I was born in 1979. So all through my youth, you stumbled across a drummer boy quarter. It was fun. Um, in the Republican Party, um, Gerald Ford will win the nomination, right? You always are going to, like 9 times out of 10, you're always going to renominate the incumbent president, right? Much like Trump and the Republicans, right? You're always going to nominate that guy because he's a known quantity. He's there. More than likely, people are going to put him back in. But as we said before, he was the only non-elected president. All right, he's barely going to beat out a young upstart. I say young, a upstart politician here, Ronald Reagan, who's the governor of California, who's going to institute what we refer to as the new right, which we'll look at in the next presentation. But basically, he's going to start cutting taxes in California, and there's going to be like an economic boom, and people are going to get fired up about Ronald Reagan. And then in turn, right, uh, he's going to be popular enough to challenge an incumbent president, which is pretty big. But yet again, Ford wins it, and it'll be Ford versus the Democrat, Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter will be the governor of Georgia, former peanut farmer, right? And he will be known, as it says right here, for his down-home sincerity. In the president's videos that I make you guys do, Jimmy Carter is the only president that actually is interviewed for the show, right? Which I found pretty cool. And Jimmy Carter's still kicking around, man. He's like in his 90s right now. And quick overview: Jimmy Carter, maybe not the best president, but in his retirement, I think Jimmy Carter is great. Uh, so, it says right here, he was naive, right? He was going to come in and he was also going to drain the swamp, right? He was going to not play the political ball game in Washington, or at least he thought, right? And what that did, right, was that led to problems. He didn't play the political game, and so it led to deadlock. It led to, if our game is you scratch my back, I scratch yours, but if you're not scratching my back, I'm not going to help you out. And he doesn't get a lot of help in Washington. As it says right here, right, his guiding principle was going to be human rights, which yet again, Jimmy Carter, Habitat for Humanity, um, big humanitarian, right? That's going to be his big thing, is about trying to make the world better for people, not necessarily fighting communism, not necessarily expanding American interests or whatever. It's all about human rights. Most famously, he will get the leaders of Egypt, or Anwar Sadat, and Israel, Mitcham Begin here, to meet at Camp David and hammer out a peace accord. Right? Remember, these countries have been kind of fighting off and on since the '60s, and eventually they're going to get the Nobel Peace Prize for it. Now, he will also be the guy that signs the deal to give Panama back the Canal Zone. Um, Late in his presidency, you will see the Iran hostage crisis. And not to kind of brush over it, but basically there's a theocratic revolution in Iran, right? And you get the Ayatollah comes to power, and when he comes to power, there's they seize the U.S. embassy and basically, and students and all these people that are Americans basically are held hostage. Um, he will try to negotiate that, but it won't be until Ronald Reagan that they're released. Also, an issue for Carter is in Africa, Angola is going to have a civil war, and out of that civil war, excuse me, there's going to be a war for independence, and then from the Portuguese, and then after that, there's a civil war in Angola where the Cubans will begin to support the communist side of the civil war, and it basically becomes South Africa versus Cuba and part of this larger proxy Cold War situation. It won't finish until 1991 when both Cuba and South Africa agree to leave. Um, the Soviet Union will invade Afghanistan, and that is commonly kind of considered their Vietnam. It was pretty easy for them to gain control of Afghanistan, and not too similar to us, right? They gained control of the sort of city centers, or urban centers in Afghanistan, but the countryside is going to be filled with people that don't want to follow them, right? They see this as a Christian or atheist invasion, and so the Mujahideen, right, the Islamic warriors, if you will rise up to expel the Soviets from Afghanistan. The United States, not wanting to be directly involved, um, will not send troops or really aid initially, right? Because they don't want, kind of what we see in Vietnam. They don't want to be able to pick up weapons and see, made in the USA stamped on them or whatever. So, if you want an interesting story around this, there is a U.S. congressman from Lufkin named Charlie Wilson, and Charlie Wilson sat at the center, or at the crossroads, I should say, of the, like, I don't remember what it was. It was like the rules committee and the, like, maybe it was like the funding for, like, military stuff. I forget that he sat on two committees, and it gave him a lot of power in this particular area. And he helped the CIA basically fund the uh, he helped the CIA to get Stinger missiles, which are shoulder-launched missiles that would shoot down Hind helicopters, to the Mujahideen, and really turn the tide of the war against the Soviets. At the end, when the Soviet Union crumbles in the early '90s, a lot of it is to the fact that the money and losses spent in Afghanistan, because eventually they have to pull out, like I said, very much like America's Vietnam. Stagflation still is going to be an issue for Carter. Remember, we said that stagflation was a combination of inflation and a high unemployment rate. You also might remember from class when I said in '73 and '79, you're going to get spikes in the overall energy crisis. It is the 1970s. In particular, remember, OPEC is going to be behind these with embargoes. The economic malaise speech, which you'll get a lot of talk about in the president's video on Carter and the crash course. The economic malaise speech is basically an ill attempt at a pep talk by Carter to get the country going. And instead of feeling like elated after his, national speech, people felt like they were lectured to, and kind of browbeat, like kind of like a teacher getting after some students or something. And in turn, it really sinks Carter his approval. Um, Lastly, deregulation, right? As a way to fight the inflation and all that sort of stuff, a lot of industries become deregulated. A lot of this regulation started, with the Great Depression and the New Deal and so forth and so on. And so you start to see, banks, the airline industry, um, what else? The energy markets, all these places begin to deregulate, right? And this will lead to economic turnaround in certain sectors, but also at the same time, people kind of feel like this also leads to some of the economic problems that we see today, right? Because sometimes deregulation does breed competition, but at the same time, it does lead to guys trying to break the rules or figure out ways to game the system, which eventually lead to these economic bubbles that burst. All right, the next one will be um, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, I think. Or it might just be Reagan, Bush, I'm not sure. But I will get working on that one.